Do you have any feed sacks or flour sacks in your quilt room? Do you collect them? Are you a fan of them? Do you have any antique quilts that may have feed sack fabric in them? Hello everyone, this is Michelle Fox and welcome to The Simple Quilter. Today I'm going to be sharing with you some information about the history of feed sacks or flour sacks. I will be showing you how you can identify them. I'll be showing you several different feed sacks as well as some quilts that were made with feed sacks or feed sack reproductions. And I'll be sharing with you some resources to learn more about the history of feed sacks and how they were used in quilting. Feed sacks are just cotton bags that were used to transport goods. Cotton bags were used to transport goods from the mid-1840s to the 1960s. The cotton came from cotton that was produced in the southern states, and I find that to be just fascinating. The cotton bag had two selvage edges at the top and the bottom, and two raw edges along the side where a seam was sewn. String was used to sew the bags together, and a lock stitch was used for sewing. Now the weave of the cotton did vary based on what was being transported on the inside. I want to show you a little bit more on how you can identify a feed sack. If you find one, if someone gives you one, or if you find one in an antique thrift store or at a garage sale, here's how you can identify a true feed sack or flour sack or sugar sack. Here is a feed sack or flour sack. At the top you have the selvage edge, you have a fold on one side, and you have a seam on the other. Now the seam comes down, it curves around and goes over to the edge. Now this is how you can tell if you have fabric from a feed sack. Some people think that you can tell from feeling the fabric, but this is the way you can tell 100% if you have a feed sack. Now feed sacks were made using thread. The thread was oftentimes removed and saved for use, but this thread makes permanent holes. These holes don't go away. So this stitching, this lock stitch comes down, in the corner it's curved and comes over to the edge. So this is a feed sack that was given to me. They weren't, for the person who gave it to me, they weren't really for sure if it was a feed sack or not. But this is how I could tell it was a feed sack or a flour sack. This one's very old. Number one, you can see the thread with that lock stitch in it. Right there. And then right here you can see where the permanent stitching has that curve. So that's how I knew this was an old feed sack. Lots of goods were transported in these cotton bags. The ones we hear about most today are flour, sugar, salt, and feed for animals. But there were lots of other products that were transported in these bags also. These included beans, rice, cornmeal, ammunition, fertilizer, currency, tobacco, and salt. These were just a few of the additional products that were transported in these cotton bags. In this video, you'll hear me refer to these bags as feed sacks, but there were other names for these: flour sack, sugar sack, salt bags, chicken linens, pretties, hen house linens, corn bags, textile bags, cotton commodity bags. These were all other names used to refer to these cotton bags that were used to transport all kinds of goods. I want to read you a quote from Edie McGinnis. She wrote a book on feed sacks. I'll be sharing that resource with you later. This is her quote. The history of feed sacks mirrors that of textiles and the growth of our nation. Feed sacks are woven into the fabric of our culture. Feed sacks played a huge part in providing fabric for clothing and household items during the Depression, and we definitely see it in lots of quilts made throughout the history of these cotton bags. Before cotton bags came about for transporting goods, goods were transported in great big wooden barrels as well as tins and boxes. Now, early packaging using cotton bags was done. However, the seams were hand sewed, but the hand sewing wasn't very durable and it wasn't a very efficient way to transport goods in these sacks simply because the seams weren't strong enough. The invention of the lock stitch is what really boosted the use of cotton bags for transporting goods, because the lock stitch was very durable, and in 1860 a commercial sewing machine was made to use this lock stitch, so then the bags began being produced more readily. So the combination of the lock stitch and the commercial sewing machine really boosted the use of the cotton bags for transporting goods. Now, there were several advantages of using these cotton bags versus the big barrels, and number one is they were cheaper, they were lighter, they required less maintenance, they occupied less storage space when they were filled, there were fewer damaged claims, and the advertising could be printed directly on the bags, and later labels were used. The bags could be sealed in just a few minutes. The new clean bags were attractive, and when they were empty, they didn't take up much space. Now, there were several big bag companies that produced these, but one of the largest bag companies was the Chase Bag Company. Henry Chase founded that company in 1847. Judson Bemis founded the Bemis Bag Company, and he was close on the heels of Henry Chase. There was also the Fulton Bag Company, and in 1885 there was the Percy Kent Bag Company, and these were just the largest ones. There were others, but these were the largest manufacturers of the cotton bags. But overall, there were more than 30 bag companies. The earliest bags were made from a heavy cotton, and the labels were stamped or printed on the bags. You can see some of those here. And women would work hard to get these labels off. You can see those. This one's a little bit more faded. But then during the 1920s, they began using printed fabrics. And there were over 18,000 patterns of fabrics used to make the feed sacks. Now, in some antique quilts, on the backs of the quilts, you can still see some of the emblems if you look closely. It's fun to look for that if you like to look for antique quilts. As you can see in just these two bags, the patterns on the fabric varied greatly, and there were several categories of different types of prints used, and I'm going to show you some examples of those. I wanted to show you some examples of the categories of feed sacks. These are some novelty prints that I have. Here's a children's novelty. I have to say, I think this one's one of my favorites. I like this one also. This is a new one I recently found. This is a kitchen novelty print that I recently found at a antique store. This was a really neat find. I actually have 2 of those. But you can see how fun those are. And that's just a few of the examples that I have. Here's some examples of some geometric prints. Another example that I have are pillowcases and border prints. And you can see this could be a border print. Oftentimes pillowcases and curtains were made using these, so you can see how that's a border print. And you can see how this is a border print and could easily be turned into curtains again or a pillowcase. The next category I wanted to share with you are just florals. And I wanted to share these in particular because I wanted to show you how they made these the same print in different colorways, just like they do today in fabric collections. I thought that was so very neat. There's large scale going clear down to small scale. And in my collection I have the most of florals. There's a category of fruit prints, and this one you can see has strawberries on it. And these 2, same pattern, different colorways, have pears on them. It's been so much fun because people have given me a lot of flour and feed sacks. If they thought that they would just bring them and give them to me. It's been a lot of fun. I love getting these. The next example I wanted to show you are paisleys. I did not have an example of a paisley. I guess this is as close as I could come, and this really isn't a paisley. This is probably more of a geometric, but I wanted to show you this one. Not absolutely very pretty, but look how easy it is to see those stitching lines from that lock stitch. And then of course the solids, and these are from actual feed sacks. So those are the categories of feed sacks. There were lots of uses for this fabric, and during the Depression these were a major source of fabric for clothing. In some of the resources that I have, you'll see advertisements for patterns that you could use to make garments using the bags. Some of the most common things made were aprons, smocks, dresses, undergarments, hand towels, curtains, tablecloths, laundry bags, bean bags, shirts, dresses, pot holders, toys for children, bibs, handbags. There were so many things that these bags were used for, and they were used to make quilts. Now the quilt behind me does have some feed sack fabric in it, and the reason that I know that is because I was able to identify some of the fabrics with the resources that I have. So I do know that some of these fabrics are feed sack fabrics. Now when you find an antique quilt like this one, you may have lots of different fabrics in there. You might have just scrap fabrics that aren't feed sacks. Antique quilts frequently had feed sack fabrics in them. However, they also had lots of other scraps in them. So I don't think that this quilt is solely made from feed sacks. I do think other fabrics during that time were used. And that's common with scrap quilts. I have a couple of examples of some real items from that time period that were made with feed sacks, and I want to show you those. I wanted to show you some examples of some items I have that were made from feed sacks. This is an apron, and it is just a darling apron. I saw this in an antique shop, and it was hanging up on a hanger, but I knew it was a feed sack when I saw this curved stitching line right there. I knew it had been made from a feed sack. So aprons were frequently made out of feed sacks and flour sacks. Here's another example. I'm not sure all of these are feed sacks, but you can see how this apron was made. When it's just a little swatch, it's hard to tell. I think I found one or two fabrics. This fabric, I believe, was from one that I found in the one of the feed sack books. Oh, I just noticed this little pocket right there. I hadn't seen that earlier. Look at that little pocket. You can see how easily these could be used to make hand towels or tea towels. One of my friends gave me this. She embroidered on this when she was young, and this is most likely made from a flour sack. And then this little doll here, some of the feed sacks and flour sacks doll patterns were printed on them, and those were made into gifts for children. And this was made from one of those. Look at the little underwear underneath. But this was made from a feed sack. And the lady who gave me this, her mother made it for her daughter. I want to tell you about something very interesting that Wes and I saw at the Harry S. Truman Museum in Independence, Missouri. We saw 2 feed sack bags that were used during a pullet pull. In 1948, the Stanley Milling Company ran a pullet pull. They commissioned the Percy Kent Company to make bags for that election year. This election year was between Dewey and Truman, so people would buy bags based on whichever candidate they were voting for. The paper label for the Republicans was printed in red and was an elephant running with a chicken as the jockey on it. The Democratic bag was printed in green and had a chicken riding a donkey. And you can see an example of each of those at this museum, the one in Independence, Missouri that I was just telling you about. So if you live around there and you're interested, be sure to go see that. It's really pretty fascinating. Now, Truman won by 54% in the straw poll or pullet poll, as well as the election. So the straw poll was a good measure of who was going to win that election. Paper sacks began to replace the fabric bags in the 1950s, so they began to fade. Cotton bag companies worked hard to hold on to the market, but eventually the paper bags replaced the cotton bags, and the feed sack production faded in the early 1960s. I want to show you a few more examples of some quilts that I have using feed sacks. There's this one behind me. This is perhaps my favorite quilt of all time. This was passed down from my husband's relatives, and it is just a beautiful quilt. You can see a little bit more of it there. It's really an amazing quilt. The next one I have to show you is an antique quilt. I purchased this one at an antique store, but it has some feed sack fabrics in it. And then I made the next 2 quilts using reproduction fabrics. Now, Linzee Kull McCray, who was responsible for writing one of the books that I'll be showing you in the resources, also produced several reproduction fabrics, and the fabrics that I used in these two quilts are some of hers. And then here's another line of hers called True Blue. She actually has several lines out. I'm not sure if you can still find these, but there are lots of different companies who manufactured reproduction lines. Next, I want to share with you some resources that you can use to find information on feed sacks if you want to learn a little bit more about them. Feed sacks are a passion of mine. I love them. I love to look at them. I love to look for them at quilt shops, and it's been a lot of fun over the years. I've done a few presentations for quilt guilds using about the feed sacks. And since then, people started giving me feed sacks. And it's just really been a lot of fun. I love to get them. I think it's amazing how they were used and how they were packaged. I just like all of it. It's just all amazing. So here are some of the resources that you can use to learn more about the feed sacks. I wanted to be sure to share some resources with you in case you wanted to add some of these to your quilt library, or if you want to check them out from somewhere just to learn more about feed sacks, flour sacks, or sugar sacks. This is a book called Sugar Sacks. It has 12 quilts using vintage or reproduction fabrics. This is put out by Glenna, Hailey. This has a little bit about the history of quilts in it, as well as patterns for some quilts. This one is Vintage Feed Sacks, Fabric from the Farm. This is put out by Susan Miller. This is a nice book. It has some history, some information about the history of feed sacks, and it has some swatches in there that you can use to help identify fabrics in your quilts. But it has a lot of swatches that are actually swatches of feed sacks, flour sacks, feed sacks and flour sacks. This is a good one put out by Linzee, Kull, McCray. Now she states in here that she is not any type of quilt historian, but this is a nice collection of information about feed sacks. And it also has lots of swatches of feed sack fabric. I really enjoyed reading this book. She also has several reproduction fabrics out that were from feed sacks and sugar sacks. This is called Cotton and Thrift, Feed Sacks and the Fabric of American Households. This is written by Dr. Marian Ann Montgomery. This is written really based on academic research. So this stuff in here is really accurate historical information. And then there's lots of swatches in this book that you can look at of feed sacks. This is called Beautiful Quilts from Humble Beginnings by Edie McGinnis. This is a nice book. This has some patterns in it if you want to make quilts with your feed sacks. There's a little bit of background on feed sacks in this one also. This is called Feed Sacks, a collection of vintage feed sacks, sugar sacks, grain, and feed bag prints and designs. Volume 1 by Tricia Maloney. Now this one has a little bit of information about the history of feed sacks, but it has lots of swatches in it also. This is a publication put out by the American Quilt Study Group. The information in this is from research papers. There's an article in this one called Feed Sacks in Georgia, Their Manufacture, Marketing, and Consumer Use, and it's by Ruth Rhoades. There's another article in the 2013 Uncoverings. If you're interested, you can find some of these online. Now again, these are true academic research papers, and this is solid information about the history of feed sacks. These are some additional resources. I'll try to put links for these if you're interested in purchasing these. I'll see if I can, which ones I can find on Amazon, and then I'll put a list of these resources in the description below. In the comments below, please be sure to tell me if you're a feed sack fan, if you have any quilts with feed sacks in them, and if you've ever used feed sacks to make a quilt. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. And until next time, have fun quilting.